Hello, everyone, and welcome to our virtual presentation of Floating in the Deep End, How Caregivers Can See Beyond Alzheimer's with author Patti Davis. Joining her tonight is historian and political commentator Max Boot. Before we begin, I'd like to remind folks that we have signed book plates available. To receive one with your purchase, please write signed book plate in the order comments when you are checking out your cart on our website. And you can access our website by clicking on the green purchase button directly below the viewer's screen. Also, if you have any audience questions, please use the Ask a Question button at the very bottom of the screen. You can also vote for any questions you like, and they'll make their way to the top. And we'll be taking audience questions towards the end of the event. All right, so let me introduce our guests, and then we can get started. Patti Davis is the author of several books, including The Long Goodbye, a moving memoir about losing her father, U.S. President Ronald Reagan, to Alzheimer's disease. Her support group, Beyond Alzheimer's, is now licensed at Geisinger Medical Center in Pennsylvania and Cleveland Clinic in Las Vegas. Her articles have appeared in Time, Newsweek, Harper's Bazaar, Vanity Fair, Washington Post, and many more. And joining her tonight as our moderator is Max Boot. Max Boot is a historian, best-selling author, and political commentator. He is the Jean J. Kirkpatrick Senior Fellow in National Security Studies at the Council on Foreign Relations and a columnist for the Washington Post. He is the author of several books, including The Road Not Taken, which was a New York Times bestseller and a finalist for the 2019 Pulitzer Prize in Biography. So with that said, I'm going to turn things over to Max and enjoy the talk, everyone.
Great. Well, it's a pleasure to be here with Patti and with everybody else to discuss Patti's, I think, very important and perceptive new book, which I would strongly encourage all of you to buy, and more than one copy if possible, just as a matter of pure reading interest. I can assure you that it's a fast read and it's well written, and it's in many cases riveting. And for me personally, I have to say that this book had two particular attractions. One is that I am actually writing a biography of Ronald Reagan, and so reading Patti's descriptions of how he coped with Alzheimer's, I think, give fascinating vignettes into his character and his final days. But I also have a more personal interest because my own stepfather is suffering from dementia. And so it's just very helpful to read this book. And I've asked Patti for guidance on a few occasions, which has also been tremendously helpful because, I think anybody in this, I think the title, Floating in the Deep End, very apt, because I think that's kind of how everybody who has a loved one suffering from this disease, that's kind of how they feel. And I think Patti does a lot to demystify the subject and to really shine a light on it, which I think will be very useful for a lot of people today and in the future. So welcome, Patti. And let me ask you kind of the classic first question of book interviews, which is, what led you to write this book? What do you hope to accomplish with it?
Well, this book came about because I ran my support group program Beyond Alzheimer's for 6 years, twice a week. And in 2017, I, for a combination of reasons, wanted to sort of let other people take the helm and bring it into another phase. And I tried licensing it to hospitals. As was mentioned, 2 hospitals licensed it, but I got a number of no's, and which sort of didn't surprise me because I just don't think that caregivers are given the care and the attention that they should be given, even though the medical community knows full well that caregiver stress is a very real thing and a very dangerous thing. Caregivers are particularly of people with dementia, are very likely to get ill and even die before the person they are caring for because of stress. I mean, the person with dementia doesn't have any stress. Every moment's new, right? It's the caregiver who absorbs everything, and sometimes with very negative effects. So I didn't succeed yet anyway in my goal of having Beyond Alzheimer's be like the AA of caregiver support groups, which is what I wanted. So I thought, okay, fine, then I'm going to write a book. I'm going to put all of the information that I have, that I've been talking about for 6 years in these groups, in a book where people can carry it around and refer to it as they need to, and have that as a lifeline. It is also part memoir, because if I'm asking people to trust something that I've suggested, whether it's an emotional insight or a practical suggestion, I think you need to know how I came to that. So it is part memoir and part handbook.
Now, obviously, your father was unique. I mean, very few people have a parent suffering from Alzheimer's who's also a former president with, Secret Service protection, worldwide fame, and so forth. How typical or not do you think his experience with Alzheimer's was and wasn't? I mean, what was typical? What was atypical about it?
Well, dementia is a great leveler. Dementia doesn't care if you were president of the United States or if you worked at Dunkin' Donuts. It's going to do, this disease is going to do what it's going to do. It is going to erode cognition. It's going to steal memory, no matter who you are. So from a very human perspective, my experience was similar to anybody else's, given the fact that it is also unique to each person because people manifest the disease in their own ways. But just in terms of the progression of the disease, what is lost, what is challenging, it wasn't really any different than anyone else. That said, obviously my parents were well off. They could hire outside caregivers. Toward the end of my father's life, he had round-the-clock nursing care. He did have Secret Service protection, so there was no risk of him wandering off the property, which happens often with people who have Alzheimer's. So, there were those benefits because of who he was. But in terms of the disease itself, it's a very humanizing disease.
One of the most poignant memories I think you have in the book is going for walks with your dad in the park, and your dad wondering, why do people recognize me? How do people know me?
Yeah, it was actually on the beach when that happened. We used to take him down to the boardwalk in Venice, and so he could be near the ocean, which he loved. And people on the bike path would recognize him and say, "Hello, President Reagan," or "Hello, Mr. President." And he would always be, it's like that instinct kicked in, and he would smile and wave, and, "Hi, how are you?" And it happened a number of times. And then finally one day he looked at me and he said, "What? How do they know me? How do they know who I am?" And I said, "Well, you're a very famous person. You were president of the United States." And he got this sort of clouded look in his eyes and went, "Oh," and I knew that he had forgotten that part of his life.
Truly tragic. You write that Alzheimer's erodes the filters that every person has and leaves, quote, the essential self.
Yeah.
What did your father's essential self look like?
He was a very kind and gentle person, and a very sweet person. And that's what remained. Who someone is at their essence is what is going to remain, which can be a good thing or a bad thing. If, sometimes people in my support group would say something like, my parent, my father, my mother, whoever it is, I think Alzheimer's turned them into a racist. I mean, now they're saying things that they never said before in their life. Or it turned my parent into this really mean person. To which my initial response was always, okay, wait a minute, let's back up here a little bit, right? Are you saying that you never saw your parent be mean in the past? Well, yeah, but not often. And I think they felt bad afterwards. And you never heard the other person that said that about racism, you never heard them. Well, yeah, I guess I heard them use the N word sometimes, but I just thought they didn't know any better. So to be clear, Alzheimer's does not turn you into a racist, and it doesn't turn you into a mean person. It exposes what was already there. So that's why I said it can be a good thing or a bad thing, right? If that person's essence is a nice, sweet person, you're going to have an easier time of it. There's still going to be upsets. There's still going to be tantrums sometimes, but at least in the earlier stages. But you're going to have an easier time of it. If that person was a cantankerous, mean, difficult person, you're in for a bumpy ride. You just got to know that.
And what do you advise in those kinds of cases? Because I mean, in some ways, you're saying that you can't really divorce those sentiments or that behavior from who this person actually is, that it actually is them. And so how do you deal with something like that, which might be very difficult and unpleasant?
Well, how you deal with it internally in yourself, there are two answers to this. The internal answer is you find a different way of looking at it, right? Rather than judgmentally, resentfully, critically, because what's that going to get you? I mean, they are who they are, right? If you stir up all of those emotions in you, you're the only one who's going to be bogged down by those. So here's an example. When during the 90s, when my father was in the earlier stages, I was doing lectures occasionally around the country about being the daughter of someone with Alzheimer's. And I would talk sometimes about looking at things from a different angle, that how important that was. And a woman came up to me after one of my lectures, and she said, that was so important for me to hear, because she said, my mother has Alzheimer's, and she described briefly her mother, who, from her description had no interest in being one. And she said, so I got it about seeing it differently. She didn't mean it. And I said, okay, wait a minute. You just described a mother who was not loving, not supportive, and kind of mean sometimes, right? And she said, well, yeah. I said, she meant it. She wasn't just in a bad mood for 30 years. She meant it. How sad for her. That's the change in perception. That's what gets you out of your own woundedness, is to realize that that other person was wounded and they don't even know it. And in her case, her mother has Alzheimer's. She'll never transition out of that meanness. She'll never be able to change who she is. How sad for her. So that's the internal reality of dealing with someone who is difficult. The practical reality is that you don't take the bait and you don't engage with them on that level. And if that means walking out of the room so you can go punch a pillow or something, then do it. But do not engage. You are not going to win if you engage them.
It seems like very wise advice. I wonder if you can talk a little bit about your experience as a caregiver and interacting with your mother, who was obviously the primary person in charge of looking after your dad. And you have very interesting observations about how your dad's illness affected the dynamic between your mother and you, between you and your siblings, and your siblings and your mother. Can you explore that a little bit?
Well, I think it's important to say first that the family whatever your family dynamic is, if you are expecting it to change because Alzheimer's has entered the picture, like, oh, we're going to be closer now, you can forget that. I mean, that works in Lifetime movies, but in real life, people tend to cling to what is familiar, and every family has its own homeostasis, right? And I'm not saying that miracles can't happen and a family can bond together, but generally, that family is going to continue to be who they always were. So what do you do with that? Again, you try to look at it differently. I mean, it was easier for me to implement the things that the insights that I was coming to about, seeing things differently and not judging and growing up and all of that with my father, because he was a very sweet man. With my mother, it was very difficult because I had been terrified of her my whole life and still was. To some degree, I was till the day she died, frankly. So it was a lot harder to put that into practice when it came to her. And I really had to work on accepting that this was this broken family that I was a part of. This was a fractured family. That's the nature. That was the homeostasis of my family. And I could, be reactive about that emotionally, which I'd been my whole life, or I could grow up and say, okay, let me take a step back here and find sympathy and find compassion. And there was a moment that I described in the book when I really got that with my mother. I really got that, she was really sort of the architect of our fractured family. I mean, she had a very divide and conquer mentality. Somebody should probably have embroidered that on a pillow and given it to her. And so she had done that very successfully with our family. But then this really tragic thing happened, and the love of her life, her soulmate, is being taken away by a disease. And she didn't have the fold of a family around her because that had never been allowed. Not that we wouldn't have been there if we could have, but first of all, nobody knew how. And secondly, she didn't really welcome that. So I learned to look at her, just as I said to that woman who spoke to me after my lecture. I learned to look at her through the eyes of sympathy and compassion rather than accusation and judgment.
You have one story in the book that stuck with me about how on one occasion you and your brothers got together and presented a united front to your mom, which is not something that had happened before. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Right. That was the moment that I just referenced when I went, okay, wow, I get it. She doesn't know what else to do. So what had happened briefly was that my father was still going into the office for a few hours every day. And, Ron didn't live here. He lived in Seattle, but Michael and I both live here. And we would stop into the office to see him, quite honestly, so that we could see him alone without my mother being there and just having some alone time with him. And what had started to happen was either one of us would arrive at the office and be told either that he wasn't there, which was really bizarre because there was a Secret Service car right in front, or that he was busy, which also didn't make much sense because it was not like he really had a lot to do in the office. So it was really clear to us that she was telling them to not let us up. And I think it was me who called Ron and told him, and Ron flew down here, and the three of us met at my parents' house. And it was stunning to me on a number of levels. It was stunning to me because the three of us had never been a united front on anything. I mean, we all had our own separate lives and our own paths. And so that was sort of stunning. But it was also stunning to me that my mother, it was very clear to me, had no idea what to do with this. I mean, here were three siblings acting like a family. She didn't know what to do with that. And that was the moment that I went, wow, I can look at her the way I always have, with some resentment, or I can look at her really with sympathy. Like, this is, she created this and now she doesn't know what to do with this united front in front of her.
Do you think that your dad's illness permanently changed the dynamics between you and your mother and you and your brothers, or was it only a transitory thing?
I don't think it changed the dynamics. I think it changed how I looked at the dynamics. I think that's all you can do. And I think that's a really important point. If you're waiting for your siblings who have never been around to show up when a parent is ill, I mean, why do you think they're going to be different now? They're not, right? But you can be different in looking at them differently. Again, through sympathy for missing out on this experience. I mean, it is difficult and it is painful, but you know, you're supposed to show up for things like that. And if you choose not to, you're losing the opportunity to learn the really valuable lessons that you can learn from this experience. And there are very valuable lessons in here.
Well, talk about a few of those lessons.
Well, growing up is a big one. You know, if you are going to come at this situation of a parent with Alzheimer's as the resentful 17-year-old or the 20-something-year-old whose, you know, parent didn't approve of their career or their relationship or their sexuality or whatever, then that's a pretty narrow, you're going to stay confined to the past that you're dragging along with you. I mean, what I did was say pretty much at the beginning, you know what, it's time for you to grow up. I just knew it. You know, you're not going to do very well in this experience if you don't grow up. And you make that choice, and sometimes you get it right and sometimes you get it wrong. But if you are continually driven forward by that choice, it will inform your experience and you will grow emotionally, right? You won't be trapped anymore in the past of what that parent did or didn't do or said or didn't say. I mean, here's the thing that I really realized was that ultimately what's important is not that a parent, didn't pay attention to you or made you feel less than or made you feel that you deserved punishment. Ultimately, what's important is that you believed them. That's the voice that trails you through the years. That's the voice that leads you into one relationship after another that mimics that relationship with a parent because you don't know any better, right? So it's about who I've said to people many times, before you ask yourself, what should I do in a particular situation that comes up with Alzheimer's, ask yourself who you are right now in that situation. Because that's going to dictate what you do. Form will always follow content.
That seems like a great insight. You actually write that, quote, in a bizarre way, my father's Alzheimer's saved my life. How so?
So when my father was diagnosed, when I got the news that he was actually diagnosed with Alzheimer's, I was in an incredibly low period of my life. I had sold my house here in Los Angeles at the bottom of the market. I lost basically everything, pretty much everything. I was fleeing an abusive relationship, and so I did what I'm prone to do. I ran away across the country to the East Coast where I didn't know anybody. And kind of everything that I did was turning out wrong. It was like if you wrote it in a book, an editor would go, oh, come on, not that many things can go wrong, right? But that's how it felt to me, like everything was going wrong. And I was just tired, and I was tired down to my soul. And I just didn't feel like I wanted to be here anymore. And I thought, well, no one's going to miss me. What is the point of me even being here? And I was really thinking that I, maybe would want to do something about that and not be here anymore. And then I got this news, and, it could have been the last straw. It could have been what pushed me over the edge, but it actually had the opposite effect. because it was bigger than my own despair. It was bigger than my problems. And I thought, I want to show up for this. I want to be there for this. And I want to get this right. And I had never told anybody about this before, not close friends, nobody. And when I was writing this book and I got to the part where he was diagnosed, I thought a lot about writing this, and I thought, you know what, I do want to write it because someone might be reading this book who is also in a really low period, who's in that same place, and I want them to think that there is something bigger than them that they can hang on to, that there is someone out there who needs them, that there is some situation out there that needs them. So that's why I included it in this book.
I think that was a brave and important decision, because I think you're helping to demystify not only Alzheimer's, but also depression and some of the feelings that and potential actions that can go along with it.
Mm-hmm.
One of the other things, and there's the book is just chock full of interesting and insightful lines that I marked down. But another one of them is that you write that Alzheimer's was actually enabling you to know your father a bit better, which seems a little bit paradoxical, obviously, because this is a disease that shuts down the person's ability to communicate with you. So how did that enable you to know him better?
Well, it shuts down one's ability to communicate, but language is not the only way that we communicate. I mean, we communicate by our demeanor and by sometimes in total silence, just what we intuitively feel from one another. And in what we talked about before, in the stripping away of all the facades, the personas that we all develop to live in this world, and you get down to the essence of that person, that is what you're getting to know. That's what you're in the presence of. And, I really told myself every time when I went to see my father, especially when I moved back to LA so I could, see him more often. Every time I went to see him, before I walked through the door, I said to myself, I don't know what's going to happen in here. I don't know how he's going to be or what I'm going to feel, but I want to be open to whatever comes at me and learn from it and grow from it. I want to really just show up as sort of an open vessel for whatever the experience is going to be. And I think if you do that, you even sometimes just on an intuitive level get to see a person that you never saw before. Someone in my support group, it was their grandmother, I believe, who had been in a Japanese internment camp and had never spoken about it. And she got Alzheimer's. She was a very sort of brittle, closed off person, but they only knew factually that she had been in the camp, and she would never talk about it. And as Alzheimer's started moving her back through time, she ended up back there. I mean, believing that she was there. And so the person who was telling me this story said, it was so painful to watch and to listen to, because I was now understanding what she went through. So this person who always had seemed sort of, not very approachable and a bit brittle, suddenly became a very sympathetic and real person because of what they had gone through, that all of that was now in the open.
How do you communicate with somebody suffering from dementia? You had an interesting point about not looking at your father when he was talking. Now, why is that helpful?
Well, it was a moment when he was, it's called word salad. That's the phrase that's sort of grown up in the world of Alzheimer's, word salad. where it's just this jumble of words. And if you're going to try to decipher that, forget it. You're not going to, you're not going to figure it out. So I realized that if I didn't look at him, then just the intonation and the emotional resonance of the words and what he was saying was what would come through to me. And then I still wouldn't know specifically what he was talking about, but I would know if he was upset or if he was amused, right? I would get the emotional reality.
That's very insightful. I mean, I can continue asking questions definitely, but I see that we have a bunch of questions in the queue here. So I'd love to give our audience members a chance to get into the conversation. Meanwhile, just
Hi.
as I say that, there's like a car alarm going off in the distance. One of the hazards of, this is like one of the hazards of New York apartment living here. So this is a transcontinental conversation since Patty's in Santa Monica and I'm on the Upper West Side of New York. But I'm happy to go to the first question that I see here in the Q&A queue, which is, I'm sure the topic of caregiver guilt came up in your groups. How do you help caregivers deal with their guilt?
Okay, guilt. I have a whole section in this book on guilt. And here's, I know this is, maybe it's going to sound silly, but it works. I think of guilt as a muscle, and we have that muscle for a reason. We need to have that. So if we do something terrible, we feel guilty about it. But sometimes that muscle likes to flex itself when it isn't needed. And so my advice is, when it does that you actually talk to your own guilt and go, okay, you know what? I'm so glad that you are here because I need you, but I don't need you right now. There is nothing to feel guilty about right now. So thank you, but later, right? And like I said, I know that sounds silly, but it actually works because, for one thing, it takes you kind of out of the seriousness of it, right? Like, I couldn't figure out what they were saying. I feel so guilty about that. If you really break that down, what in the world is there to feel guilty about? The person just, I use the phrase word salad. They just presented a whole jumble of words to you and you're supposed to understand what they're saying. Generally speaking, when someone feels guilty, there is nothing to feel guilty about. It's just that muscle is flexing itself because it chose to, right?
What about guilt over, or misgivings over, earlier stages of your relationship with that person, where you feel bad about something that happened in the past that you did or they did, and then you would love to be able to somehow have a meeting of minds and set it straight and clean the slate and so forth, and that becomes impossible because this person is no longer in a position to do that, to engage with you in that way.
Well, I think you don't look for that engagement. I mean, I apologized to my father for things that I did. And my belief from the outset was, and I said this in this book, was that his soul could not have Alzheimer's. So even if cognitively I didn't get a response to my apology or to what I was saying, my faith, my belief was that in his soul, he heard me. And I believe that very, very strongly. So if there are things in your past that you need to apologize to with that person, do it. But do it without the expectation that they're going to respond. Maybe they will. Maybe there'll be a window right then and they will. But believe that in their soul, in their heart, they heard you.
Okay, we're going to go from guilt to the other G word. The next question is, do you have any advice for people who are struggling with embracing their grief?
Yes, grief is a thread that runs all through this book. And I have said to people at the very beginning stages, when someone has just been diagnosed, I have said to people, how are you doing with your grief? People have looked at me like I was crazy, because we think of grief as surfacing when someone has died. But Alzheimer's is a death before dying. And you're going to really help yourself if you start surrendering to your grief and allowing yourself to go through it from the beginning. That means taking some time for yourself, sitting still, silently, letting all of those emotions come up. It's scary. We don't want to do it. You know, we find all sorts of ways of avoiding grief. And Alzheimer's gives you ample opportunity to avoid that because you can just keep yourself really busy with that person, right? I don't have time to sit by myself and you know, think of my own emotions and what I'm going through, because I have to make sure they don't wander out the front door, and I have to dress them, and I have to feed them, and you know, people who can get outside caregivers. I realize that there are some people who can't afford that, but people who are absolutely can have other people come in and help don't want to, because they know intuitively if they keep themselves really busy, then they can avoid their grief. We tend to think that grief, if we push it away far enough and send it out to the South 40, that it will disintegrate and then we won't have to deal with it. It doesn't work like that. Grief is not biodegradable. It will wait for you and it will come find you. And if it has to come find you, it's going to bring you to your knees. It's going to bring your life to a standstill until you deal with it. So it's better to just embrace it from the beginning. And you know what? There are a lot of colors on that palette. It's not just sorrow. It's not just pain. We grieve because we loved, right? There is sweetness to that grief. And I think that's a really important thing to remember. There's joy even in that grief over the memories that you have and the love that you shared.
The next question is, there are families who are full-time caretakers because they can't afford outside care. How can they take care of their own mental health while taking on this responsibility?
Yeah, I'm very conscious that is a reality for a lot of people. You know, if you can find a friend to sit with that person, even for a couple of hours, if there is another family member who will do it. A lot of times, someone in my support group used to tell people this, and I thought it was a very good suggestion. A lot of times, if you look at an insurance policy, buried in there are allowances for like a couple of hours of caregiving that they will cover. And if you sort of cobble, like maybe if there are two insurance policies, you sort of cobble those together, you can get like a few hours a week or something of outside care. So that's one thing to investigate also. But, you know, try to, like I said, you know, reach out to a friend, ask if they would just sit with that person for an hour or maybe 2 hours, you know, so that you can have that time for yourself.
What if you have a choice? I mean, you have the means to hire a caregiver. Is that something you should do? Is that preferable to trying to do it yourself or try to do it in cooperation with other family members?
Yes, because you know what? None of us are trained to do this. Caregivers are trained to do this. Caregivers are trained to deal with someone who doesn't know how to dress themselves. When it gets down the line and bathing becomes an issue and they need help with that, you're not trained to do that. Caregivers are trained professional caregivers are trained to do that. Also, you know, bathing also becomes an issue usually. For some reason, there's some resistance to that at some point with most people. They're going to act that out with you as a family member much more than with an outside person, because you're familiar and because they can, right? I'm sorry, but they're not going to, Alzheimer's is not going to remove that from their memory. They're going to, like, pushing your buttons is not going to, they're not going to forget how to do that, right? So it's better to have an outside person. They'll be much more cooperative.
And just as a practical matter, what's the best way to find an outside person?
I would suggest going to agencies so that you have a backup. Well, first of all, so you know that they've been vetted, and that there's, they're licensed, but also if something happens, if they get ill and can't come, then you can get a backup. I mean, there are people who work independently, but I would personally suggest going to an agency so that you have a backup. And ask if you know other people who have dealt with dementia and have hired care. Ask them who they hired.
Is it better to try to keep somebody at home with home health care or to move them into a memory unit in a nursing home?
It's such an individual decision. It really is. I mean, the advantage of a facility, if you can do that, is that there is 24/7 care. They're not going to wander off. There's always going to be someone there. There's going to be a structure to the days, which is really important. But, it's a very individual decision. It is going to get more costly to keep someone at home with caregivers because the level of caregiver that you're going to need is going to be elevated. My father's, the last few years of his life, he had to have registered nurses because he was bedridden.
Next question is, what was one special moment you shared with your family during your father's Alzheimer's?
I would say that the day that I was sitting outside with my father at that house, and it had rained, I think, that morning. And so the sky they lived up on a hill, and the sky was really beautiful, and the sky over the city was really beautiful. The city looked really sparkly. And my father was looking out at the city, and he said, "He does good work." And I wrote about this in the book, and I just took a guess, and I said, "God?" And he looked at me, and I mean, he was present in that moment. There are moments when they show up, and he said, "Yes, he does good work." And it showed me that there are apertures in this disease. If you believe, like I did, that his soul couldn't be sick, there are windows, there are little openings that happen, but they're really quick, and you have to really pay attention.
The final question we have from this terrific audience is, what was different about writing this book compared to your previous books?
Well, the only other book I wrote about Alzheimer's was The Long Goodbye, and I wrote that while I was going through the experience of losing my father. And I wrote it in journal form. So this was really sort of a sequel to that book, because in the years that followed, I was able to really understand what I had learned. I also had by this point, I'd run a support group for 6 years. So I had a lot more information and a lot more insights and a lot more confidence in the insights that I had developed. My other books are mostly fiction, so I've written more fiction than nonfiction. But this I think really is I think of it as a sequel to A Long Goodbye.
Well, it's been a terrific conversation. I'm cognizant of the fact that we are coming up on the witching hour here, but I think I can speak for everybody in saying we've been very lucky to be able to share this conversation with Patti. And I think we're all, at least I can speak for myself, I'm very grateful for your insights, again, both as a biographer and as a son. I think it's incredibly valuable, and I think it's incredibly valuable for anybody who is in this position or will be in this position. And I would hope that the Beyond Alzheimer's concept gets spread around more widely, because I think it can do an awful lot of good for people who are kind of neglected and underserved by the medical community. So I thank you for that, and I thank you for writing this book that shines a light on this important and dark and mysterious topic.
Oh, thank you. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much, Patti. Thank you so much, Max. That was such a wonderful conversation. And thank you to those who tuned in tonight. If you tuned in late, don't worry. A replay of this talk will be available after the broadcast ends. So you'll be able to watch it from the very beginning. Also, we have signed book plates available. So to request one with your purchase, please write signed book plate in the order comments when you're checking out your cart. And you can access our website by clicking on the green purchase button directly below the viewer screen. But that about does
great Thanksgiving and Christmas present.
That is true. Yes, I would recommend that you shop early for the holidays, and it will be a great gift, especially since we have book plates available. But with that said, I think that about does it. Thank you again, Patti and Max, and have a great evening, everyone, and happy early holidays.
Thank you.
Right. Good night, everyone.
Good night.
Bye.